Okay. Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon. Welcome to JWA's Book Talks. I'm Judith Rosenbaum of the Jewish Women's Archive. As always, very glad to gather with all of you today. Please say hello in the chat box. Make sure that you're chatting to everyone. We love to know who's with us in the room. Let us know where you're coming from. Um, Ask your questions in the chat throughout the program, and I'll try to bring them into our conversation. A few words about JWA for anyone who is new to us. We are a digital archive that expands and transforms the way we understand history and Jewish culture by documenting and sharing Jewish women's stories and by paying special attention to how gender functions in the past and present. We do this work because we believe that uncovering a more diverse and nuanced story is how we're going to create a better world. We are very grateful to have all of your partnership in that effort. So thank you for being here. This is just one piece of our work. All of our virtual programs are just one small part of the work of JWA. So please, I encourage you to go to jwa.org and check out all of the things that we do and the resources that we offer. I ensure you that it will be fun and illuminating. Um, those of you who would like captioning, you can click the button that says CC or show captions on the bottom of the screen. That should work for you. Excuse me, I'm getting over a little bit of a cough. Okay, I am so delighted to welcome our featured author for today. Dr. Sara Glass is a psychotherapist, writer, and speaker based in New York. She's the author of the personal memoir Kissing Girls on Shabbat, which we will be talking about today. She holds a PhD in psychology from Capella University and a master's in social work from Rutgers. She's the clinical director of Soul Wellness NYC, a private psychotherapy practice in Midtown Manhattan. She also serves as the clinical supervisor for Jewish Queer Youth, a nonprofit organization that supports and empowers LGBTQ youth. Sara has a specific expertise in treating complex trauma and PTSD and providing art and play therapy to children and adolescents, as well as general experience treating a whole range of the things that we humans struggle with, like anxiety, depression, relationship challenges, stress, all of those uh, human things. We are so glad to have you with us today, Dr. Glass. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here. And I'm just so honored to have this opportunity. I can start by giving a little bit of a summary of the book for anybody, or like just the beginning of the book for anybody who maybe hasn't read it. And it's okay if you haven't read it yet. You'll still learn a lot through this conversation. If you have read it, it'll probably help you inform some of your questions. So I began to write this book, Kissing Girls on Shabbat, in 2017, very soon after leaving the Orthodox Jewish community at the age of 32. As I was like getting ready to leave my like cloistered enclave of ultra-Orthodox Judaism and move to the city, I knew that I wanted to do something. I wanted to do something to address the systemic inequities that I faced while in the community and to help other people like me who may still be suffering in that community or so many others like that one. And so I began to write this book because I knew that story was the way to change hearts, and that no matter how much I lectured and no matter how many articles, academic articles I wrote, it wouldn't be the same as opening up my personal story. And so this book begins, Kissing Girls on Shabbat, with me at 19 years old in Hasidic Borough Park, where I was raised. It's exactly like what you may have seen in the documentaries. My father wore a big fur hat. My mother wore wigs and dresses and skirts like down below her knees. And it was like a very copy paste. Everyone's mothers and fathers looked exactly like mine in Hasidic Brooklyn. I was raised in a world where it wasn't that we had banned books, the entire world was banned. We had access only to what was deemed appropriate to be allowed within the walls of our homes and schools. So that was like mostly Jewish novels, Holocaust memoirs, and a couple of old fashion books like the Bobbsey twins or Nancy Drew were allowed into my school library. I had no TV, no movies, no radio, no non-Jewish music, other than when I would hear it on the loudspeaker at the Gap or Rite Aid, at which point I was trained to try not to hear the words and to tune it out. The whole idea was that I would grow up to be pious and I would marry a boy from the boys' school several blocks away. And I would have many children with him. And if I were to do that, everything would be great. I would be on this path toward heaven and end up like being close to God in the afterlife in a garden of abundance. And if I didn't do that, I was told that bad things would happen, a hellish afterlife where I would be have to endure like physical punishment for not having followed the word of God, and I would never have fulfilled my mission on this earth. And so I really, really wanted to do the right thing. And this book is about me trying and failing to do what I thought was the right thing. My biggest hurdle at that time at 19 was that I just couldn't seem to stop falling in love with girls. And that sets the stage for a conflict and like just an escape story, a self-wrestling story, a trauma story, all of which I tried to write through the lens of like a psychotherapist. I wanted to write as viscerally and as honestly as possible. So anyone else who's felt this way, no matter what their situation was, might be able to relate. And I can read an excerpt now, or we can do it sort of when we get to that part of the story. This will be from after first marriage.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit and then you can bring some in. Um, what was it like for you when you started writing? Like, had you been writing all along? Did you see yourself as a writer? How did it I relate so much to the idea of understanding that story is the key. It's based that's basically the foundation of our work at JWA, so that really really resonates. But it feels like this was, I mean, it's such a powerful book, first of all, but also seems like it would be a really difficult and painful one potentially to write. And I'm curious, sort of, how you started making sense of all of it and putting it into narrative in that way.
Yes. So at first, having just like left the community, I was very dissociated from my own body and my own experiences that I had like endured for so many years. And so I wrote my first version of the story as almost like a shellacked version. I
Mm,
presented myself as I found this perfect new life. Everything's great now. My idea was people who felt afraid to change their lives would read it and say, "Oh, she's great now. I can do it too." And I brought it to a memoir coach. At that time, I worked with Shulam Dean, who wrote All Who Go Do Not Return, which is one of the most like heart-wrenching memoirs of leaving Hasidic Judaism. And
yeah,
he said,
heard that one.
"Mary, like you gave me a story that's already done.
Mm,
You're not telling me what happened. You need to open up and tell us what happened and what went on."
mm.
And he said, write drunken drafts, drafts that you don't think anyone's going to read, just type to yourself. And so then I began the exploration of like, okay, here is how this felt. Here are the mistakes I made. Here are the ways in which I felt really trapped and hopeless and the times when that happened. And I wrote a couple of versions. Version 2 was angry, victim-y, and flat. I was the victim and I survived and became the hero and everyone else was bad. And then I had to get to version 3, where I was able to see the perspective of some of the other characters in the book, the men I married, the rabbis who tried and failed to have an impact on my life in a positive way. And so that became like version 3 became the foundation of the book you see today.
Who did you see yourself as writing for? Because I could imagine it would be a very different project to write for people within the community or to have a broader audience of people who might not be familiar with the world that you grew up in.
Yes. Um, and I wanted it to be accessible. I didn't want it to be something so niche, that most people wouldn't get it. I had to write the book like with the audience I imagined was 15-year-old me.
Mm,
15-year-old me who was searching for answers and fighting herself. I also, as the clinical supervisor at Jewish Queer Youth, I work with so many 15-year-old me's. And I know how many like queer youth and even just youth who are stuck in systems that don't feel right for them, feel forced into the futures their parents have chosen for them, and feel scared to deviate or to be whoever they want to be. And so I imagined that, like being able to have my book reach people beyond the walls of the worlds in which they live and having them read it and be like, oh, this girl tried it. She tried to marry away the gay. She tried to deny who she was. It wasn't this, it's almost like a cautionary tale, like that might not be such a good idea for me to try, for example. And it's been fascinating to get responses from people within the community and within so many communities since the book came out. We can talk about that too.
Yeah. Um, there's sort of this new little cottage industry of literature of these off the derech memoirs, memoirs of people who have left the ultra-Orthodox community. You mentioned Shulam Dean's book, All Who Go Do Not Return. I think that's what it's called, right?
Yeah.
Um, were there others that were either books of that were specifically about um, leaving the Hasidic world, or others that were, various kinds of coming of age stories that were influential to you as you were, um, making your life decisions and coming to writing this book?
Yeah, so I actually read a lot of ex um, fundamentalist Mormon memoirs
Mm,
as I was in the community because it wasn't safe for me to have the exit memoirs we call them exit memoirs of Orthodox Judaism. If I had those lying around the house, like that would not have been okay for me to have
right.
in my world. But I was able to read like ex-Mormon memoirs because no one knew what those books were. No one recognized the titles. And I can always say it was for work. That's the great thing about being a therapist. You can read whatever for
Mm,
work,
hmm.
to an extent. And so I read a lot of Martha Beck. I actually really think Martha Beck is maybe one of the most underrated writers of our time. She wrote Expecting Adam and Leaving the Saints and several other books. Harvard educated life coach who was raised in Mormonism in a very dysfunctional family and then had to fight her way out. And some other Alyssa Wall. These are books you would not have expected me to read, but they felt the most aligned with my lived experience of being a Hasidic woman.
Mm. That's so interesting. I know from my friend Tova Mervis, who we've had on the book talks as well, that her memoir about her divorce became very, very popular in the Mormon community. And she was like, "Who knew? I'm like a Mormon celebrity." But I guess it goes both ways. It makes sense that there would be sort of um, similar experiences of what it is to leave a fundamentalist upbringing.
Yeah, it's that same like grappling with yourself and thinking, wait, am I the crazy one or is the world around me crazy? The
Yeah.
same inborn fear, like the fear that starts from underneath your bones, that's been there for your entire life. And the same like feistiness of the individual who's able to face that fear and like grab it by its horns, and then decide to move through it. So there's so many similar dynamics.
One of the things that I was thinking about as I was reading your book, has to do with that question of like, how do you come even to have ideas that are so different from where you grew up? I mean, we talk a lot at JWA about the importance of role models. So much of our work is about that, sort of helping people see themselves reflected in the archive. And we often say, if you can see it, you can be it, meaning like you need to see visions of who you could become to really be able to imagine that. But I always think when we say that, in fact, we used to say, if you can't see it, you can't be it, or you can't be what you can't see. And I was like, I don't like that version of it because obviously there are people who don't see it but are still able to become it. And so I didn't want to like erase that experience from the way we talk about that work. But I'm always sort of amazed by that, like how it is that somebody could grow up in a world where there's not a variety of models of ways to live or what to believe or what to think, and still develop a very strong sense of your own understanding of the world that was not the one that was transmitted to you by your family and community. And I'm sort of in awe of that because I haven't done that. I'm similar to I mean, I'm different in some ways, but mostly reflect the values I grew up with. Um, so I'm just sort of curious, like, how do you think about that? Like, where does that come from? How do you cultivate that? How do you, um, come out of a world where there's it's very clear that their choices are not a thing that are possible and develop a real commitment to that. One of the things that I thought was so beautiful in your book was how you really strive to parent so differently and give your children a real sense that like they are going to be able to have choices that they can make.
Mhm. Right. I have so much to say on this. I don't even know where to start, but let's dig in because as a trauma therapist, as a parent, as a survivor of like this restrictive culture, the first thing I'll say is I think children are born knowing who they are. There's an innate sense of self, and I hear this just from so many queer people too. Like there's kids who will say at 5 years old, I love my friend who's a girl, like little girls will say, and I want to be close to her. I want to touch her. But then the world around us dissuades us from who we are. It tells us that like that's not possible. That's not preferable. That's not a good idea. And there's so many like queer narratives like that. I know for me as like an eighth grader, I remember thinking I really love ties. I want to marry a man who wears ties, which I shouldn't have wanted to marry. I should have wanted to marry a man who wore long black coats, no ties.
Mm,
That was like the garb in my culture. But I was like, I'm going to go a little more modern because then my I can pick out ties for my husband.
mm,
But what I really wanted was to wear a tie,
right.
pick out ties for my husband. And I didn't know that. I didn't know how to articulate that. But I knew that every time I went shopping with my friends, I was in the tie store. So like my brain was able to only process like some of what my body wanted to do.
Hmm.
And that's where education becomes so important because without access to books and media and other ideas, our brains and our cognitive development literally gets curtailed and put into the box of what we're familiar with. We might have an inborn knowing, right? But with like the external world and lack of education and language with which to express that or to be allowed to discover that, that internal knowing will get quashed. I think most of the time, until there's a glimmer of something someone might see on the outside that matches that internal knowing. And for me, that happened at Rutgers when I finally left the community and went to college at 20 years old in my full garb. I went to like Rutgers University where everyone was just regular American college students. Those were times when I heard ideas that started waking me back up. And it was challenging because my life was not structured for that at the time.
Right.
But it didn't happen on its own. I needed to learn different things and have access to different information. And that's when I became so passionate about providing that to my children because I knew that as long as they lived in a world where their education was so limited, their access to information was so limited, their dreams would be so limited as well.
Yeah. Um, you've talked already a little bit about sort of how you bring your therapeutic training to thinking about your own life. And your story includes a lot of experiences of trauma, unfortunately. But they're also, it's clear in your book, you're sort of talking about the gap between what you knew professionally and what you were able to kind of see in your own life. And I'm curious how you learned to relate, to tie those more together so that you could, I mean, obviously it's hard for anybody to apply their, that's why people aren't their own therapists. But how have you tried to connect those personal and professional insights and experiences more?
Yes, I mean, for people who maybe haven't read the book, I'll share like one little details. Like at the time that I had a master's in social work, was 24 years old, I still didn't understand the function of bills that would come in the mail to my home. Like I thought they were just pieces of paper you could choose to look at or discard. I knew so little about the world, and I would just get like phone bills and electricity bills and throw them in the garbage. And then when I got the envelopes were like more bright and orange because they were about to shut things off, I'd be like, oh, this seems important. And sometimes I would open them. Sometimes I would only find out why it was orange later after a consequence happened. And so there's like so much I knew about the world. I knew all about cognitive theory. I knew about the stages of development. I knew how to structure a treatment plan. I knew how to diagnose a patient with a mental illness. I didn't know how to pay a bill. And like, I didn't know also how to consider the needs of my own body. I was so dissociated.
That was
Um,
one of the things that I thought was both funny and also very poignant as you talk about learning about like female anatomy and the clitoris and orgasms, and you were like not familiar with those words and sort of said you had this line where you were like, "Oh, I thought that those were like pop culture things like Dancing with the Stars that I didn't really need to know about, didn't apply to me."
right. I was like, oh, like that's like we call it gayish. Like that's not not religious. Those are just like outside words. And at that time, I already had two children,
Right.
or was pregnant with my second one and didn't know, like, I didn't know that people should enjoy having sex. Piece of information I was lacking as a person who was married with children or can enjoy if they choose to, that would be an option that existed at all. I thought it was just an obligation. Um, and so how do I reconcile the two? My academic knowledge and like my book learning with my personhood. I think I'm still doing that.
Hmm.
In many ways, I will be doing that for the rest of my life. It's so different to know what I'm doing in my therapy office and then to go home to like my children, my partner, and to be aware of my own internal triggers, to know when things are coming up. And so I think probably at least like a couple of times a week, I'll be like, oh, the thing I said, yeah, I'll tell my daughter, yeah, I told you not to take the train because I just got really nervous about the train for some reason. But you can take the train. Like you're 18 years old. Don't worry about upsetting me. You do whatever you need to do. And
Yeah.
I'll have to apologize and trace back often because I
Mhm.
catch myself in old moments.
Yeah. I mean, I will say that I think that's true of all people. Like, we often have divides between what we understand about our own lives and what we understand about the world. I think it just seems more stark when it's knowledge that is more culturally acceptable for people to have in secular environments.
Yeah, and it's also like really stark when it's like, for some people I've dated in the past, they're like, "Wait, you're a doctor. You're still wearing your blazer. You just came to see me from work and you don't know how to have a conversation over dinner. You can't tell me what you want for dinner." It's so jarring,
Right.
the difference between how I look and how I feel some of the time.
Hmm.
So I'm lucky to be with someone now who is like, okay, honey, I know you might not know what you want for dinner. That's okay. I'm just going to sit here for 10 minutes and here's three options because sometimes it's still hard for me to know what my body wants.
Yeah. Um, One of the other big themes that you're grappling with in the novel is about mental illness, your mother and your sister's mental illness, which, is very connected, I think, in that it's also it's a way that you're trying to grapple with sort of the secrecy of the community and shame. Um, but one of the things that occurred to me in reading the book is that in some ways your sister's illness also kind of gave you a model of somebody who lived outside of the rules and strictures of the community, which seemed um, obviously painful and complicated in a lot of ways, but also maybe a doorway in some sense.
Yeah, this is not in the book. I'll give you some things that are not in the book for a minute. When I was 15, I saw my sister Shawnee for the first time in several years. She had gone inpatient psych when I was younger, when I was 7, and then moved out of the home. And when I was 15, she came back to visit and she was wearing a skirt with a slit up to her thigh. I had never seen anyone in my family wear anything like that. And she took me ice skating and horseback riding.
Mm,
I'd never done either of those things. But she wanted to come back and take me on a trip, and my family was being extra super nice to her because she'd been through so much. So she was allowed to be a little bit different because she was mentally ill.
hmm.
And then I visited her at the apartment she was staying at with a friend, and I watched TV for the first time.
Hmm.
flickering old screen, and I think maybe it was a Friends episode. I understood nothing of what was going on, but I did that my sister had a screen and that she watched it and she was okay. So that may have in some way given me like this idea that there is another world. It still didn't look attractive to me because she
Mhm.
was picked by the family and she was sick, so it felt like, okay, if the cost of living a more free life is losing one's mind, I don't know if I'm willing to pay that price, but it still was a little bit of exposure.
Right. Do you want to read the excerpt and give people flavor, people who haven't had the chance to read the book yet, a little taste?
So as I got married off at 19, had two children. People, and I'll just to give background to the excerpt, people ask my daughter now, how long were your parents married? And she goes, how long does it take to have two kids and run? The marriage was like 4 years, two kids. And I got divorced, but one of the conditions of my divorce, to make a long story like really cryptic, is I had to agree to raise my children as Orthodox for the rest of their entire lives in order to get divorced. And so I knew that I would need to play at Orthodoxy and act Orthodox on the outside to maintain custody of my children. So that meant continuing to be religious, covering my elbows and hair, and never being seen like, with a woman, for example, something like that, or even touching a man who I wasn't married to in public. Those things would mean losing custody of my children. Right after the divorce, 3 days later, I decided to give myself like a few days off. And I went as far as I could to Aruba and figured I could be safe to experiment like miles away, um, and try to just be like experience the relief of being out of my marriage. And so this is a scene from right when I got to Aruba. I bargained, holding my prayer book to my face, whispering into the thin pages. Hashem, God, I will find my way back to you. I promise. Please keep my baby safe. Please. And then I sinned. I dug tiny red pieces of spandex out of my suitcase. I opened my phone's internet browser, connected to the Sheridan network, and found the Victoria's Secret model who made the spandex seem like the key to a whole new life. I tied the fabric onto my body just like hers, strings above my hips and double knots around my back. Not bad. My skin was whiter. I had purple stretch marks on my thighs and silver ones along my stomach. Instead of golden cleavage, I had small pale lumps underneath the triangles tied to my chest. But all in all, I was passable as a person who may or may not have birthed two babies. Down on the beach, I blinked in the intense brightness. I scanned the palm trees, the bare glistening limbs on beach chairs, the children running into the sea. Good. No women in wigs or snoods. No plastic kosher supermarket bags at the foot of chairs. No telltale side curls framing the faces of little boys. If there were Orthodox Jews here, they too were defecting, and therefore I was safe. They would not dial their relatives in New Jersey and whisper about the therapist who got almost naked in Aruba, not if they were here doing the same.
Thank you. And I think that, sorry, my dog has something to say. I think that excerpt gives a good sense of the kind of like rigidity and surveillance that is necessary to maintain that kind of community. Um, and then later in the book, there's more kind of scenes of liberation in some ways. But I think also one of the things that comes through is um, in your story is the sense of loss in a lot of ways. I think especially what as it relates to your sisters. And I'm curious if there are, you talked about sort of writing different versions of the book that sort of moved more towards nuance. And what are the things that you've taken with you, or that either that you missed that you had to leave behind, or that you've been able to bring with you into your life now from the world you came from?
Okay, so that's really, there's so many things that I was able to, that I feel like are still so important to me. When I talked earlier in our little intro about this sense of meaning, right? If I were to stay on this Orthodox path, I would have meaning in my life and there would be a purpose to it. That was so important to me. I am a person who really appreciates living a meaningful life. And when I left Orthodoxy, I had to question, like, am I supposed to just be a heathen now? Am I supposed to just chase pleasure? Does that mean I've healed if I no longer care about what my thoughts mean? And the impact of every single one of my actions on the entire universe is healing being the opposite of that. And I did some of that. I did the clubbing scene and the bar scene in New York. I tried it, and book two will be about some of the mishaps along that path. But ultimately, I am a passionate person, and I chose the career I chose for a reason. And no matter what the greater scope is, and if there's like a God watching or not, I knew that, like, I figured out that I would live my best life by working to help other people and by trying to be intentional about my place in the universe, for my own family, like in terms of my impact on my community. And so I brought with me this idea, I think, of tikkun olam, this Jewish concept of we're not just here like to be seeking pleasure, to be living like free lives. There's also a way in which we can be here to help. And so that's like a strong Jewish value I hold. And there are so many things within different aspects of Judaism that I found very meaningful. There's this one line in Pirkei Avot, which is like Ethics of Our Fathers, this chapter book that we used to read in Hebrew on Shabbat afternoons when I was growing up during the summer months for some reason. But there's this one line, and I don't know if anyone here will understand my like Hasidic Ashkenazi Hebrew. Lo alecha hamelacha ligmor. It is not upon us to finish the work, but that does not mean we're absolved from trying. V'lo ata ben chorin lihibatel mimena. You're still not absolved from trying. And I feel like that resonates for me so much. I don't have to solve social justice in this lifetime. I don't have to solve gender inequality. I don't have to solve arranged marriage for Orthodox Jewish young girls and boys and people of all genders. I won't. But that doesn't mean I'm not going to try. And that comes ironically from the same roots, like, that all the other things came from.
Yeah, it is such an interesting question around sort of um, the richness and diversity of Judaism and of any religious tradition, and how what gets, what are the threads that get picked up in different places and by different people and at different times. And, sort of I think there's often that question of like, sometimes people get criticized for kind of picking and choosing, and there'll be the sense of like, you don't get to pick and choose, right? But the truth is, everyone picks and chooses. Even in ultra-Orthodox communities, people pick and choose. That is not like a liberal Judaism. Liberal Judaism doesn't have the corner of the market on picking and choosing, right? Like everyone picks and chooses what are the pieces that they're paying attention to and listening to and kind of lifting up the most. Um and I wish people could be more honest about that.
Yeah, that is one of the things I talk about often. It's like unlearning toxic Judaism, which is you exactly that, and that you can actually pick and choose. And that's how you don't lose it all. It's so powerful to not have to lose it all.
Right. I think one of the big questions that the book raises is this very core question of like, how do communities that are based on kind of shared values or adherence to certain rules and norms also make room for the diversity of people's needs and experiences? Um, it's not a question, obviously, that you can answer, um, or that I would expect you to answer, but I think it comes through very powerfully in your book that like it's a challenge. It's not like it isn't, it's not like there's an easy answer for that. I mean, I'm sure from your experience, you have thoughts about how some people could be doing better at that, certainly. Um, but I think it's a question that is, again, like it's very easy for people. I think about this often when I read books like yours, where it's very easy for someone who is a liberal Jew to like be like, oh, that, thank God I'm not ultra Orthodox. But I think it's a question that actually like is true in every community. Like, what are the rules and norms that where we draw lines, and how do we make sure that we're making space for the diversity of people's experience? So I ask that question not as like it's a question that is owned only by people who live in more extreme communities, but like actually it's a question every community needs to ask itself.
That's actually a really good way to frame that because I think there are factions within any extremist culture where they are not asking that question, right? I remember this one time when I was applying to kindergarten for my daughter, and I was already a single mother in a very Orthodox community, so I was already circumspect. And I went to the Jewish school office to get an application, a paper application. It was 2009 so that I could fill it out for my daughter. And when I went to pick up the application, I was wearing coral ballet flats, a long brown pleated skirt that hit the middle of my calf, and an oversized brown sweater and a full wig. That outfit came under scrutiny, and I wasn't even given the application.
Hmm.
The secretary at the office knew enough to say, "Oh, we don't have any left. You'll have to come back later." And then later I got a call like, "You don't need to bother coming by," because the shoes were too bright and I wasn't wearing thick enough stockings.
Hmm.
So they're not asking, how do we create space for the diversity of other people's experiences, right?
Right.
They're asking the opposite question. How do we only accept people who are in line with what we want them to look like? So,
Right.
how do we get people to ask the question? I think is through continuing to share stories like my own.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about what reactions have been to your book.
Yes. So it's been Firstly, I've been so grateful. I know some of you here on this call have already written reviews because I've seen your reviews. I'm reading this for JWA and here I am. And I just like touched my heart so much and it made me so excited to come here today. And I really, really appreciate it. Every single person who takes the time to read and review. My agent is telling me now to ask people to put them on Amazon. I don't know why that one over other ones, but like I told him I'd say it from now on. Thank you. I've gotten overwhelmingly positive feedback. If you look at the genre of memoir, they're not usually rated very well. People have so many criticisms on other people's lives, and I've been like overwhelmed by how many people understood what I was trying to do in this book. Of course, there's some negative comments, but there always will be. And I didn't get nearly as eviscerated as some of the other ex-Orthodox writers have gotten, which was nice to see. Maybe it was like having a doctorate, or like hopefully the way I wrote with a little bit of compassion toward my former community. I also get so many messages from inside of various closets.
Mm.
I have people reaching out to me who say, "I'm not safe to have your book. Can you advise me on like how do I listen to it? Or can you tell me where I can borrow it so I don't have to have it in my home?" People message me like, "I listened to your whole book in the car and then deleted it. And like, I just want you to know this is the first time I've heard anyone that felt like express anything close to what I'm going through. I'm 40, I'm gay, married in the community, 19, about to be married off, thinking maybe I shouldn't let myself get there." Um, Raised in fundamentalist like Catholicism, evangelical religion, like spaces, and just so many people have reached out to me. I really get messages every day, just people saying thank you for writing this book.
That's amazing.
Beyond what I ever expected. All I thought was like maybe I'd reach one person and that person wouldn't get arranged married.
Right. And that would be enough, but I'm glad that you've reached beyond that. There were some questions in the chat about what what your relationship is like now with your sisters, with your families, which, I guess is a different piece of the reaction to this book.
Yes. So for anyone who hasn't read the book, my sisters helped to raise me because my mother had some mental illness, probably secondary to being post-Holocaust. And so my sisters were the ones who took me shopping for lingerie before my arranged marriage, like really helped. They made me this little cookbook of recipes and they each put in the foods that they knew I liked. And then I called them when I was a young wife, and they would sit on the phone with me for hours and say, no, you put the sugar in after the flour. And it's okay if you don't have salt, you can substitute it with this, and it'll still like they helped me through my pregnancies, my births, everything until I wanted to get divorced. And that really freaked them out. They didn't think I would be okay if I made that decision, and they thought making that decision meant that I was potentially mentally ill, like our sister and mother. And so our relationship got strained after that, as you can see in the book. And then since like leaving the community and coming out of the closet, we no longer have a connection. We're not in communication, which is heartbreaking to me. Part of like writing the book, I didn't want to think about it at the time, but I wrote the book thinking maybe they'll read it and they'll finally understand why I made these choices. I've heard that they haven't read it. At the same time, I understand because I was one of them and I lived in that community, and I know how scary it is when somebody questions everything that you stand for. And so and how dangerous it is to have a sister who's an out, proud lesbian, when you're trying to live a protected life in a culture that judges people who are even related to somebody different. So that's where that is at.
Yeah. Um, you talked a little bit about, the impact of your book on others, and I'm curious about how telling your story what it's changed for you to be able to actually tell your story and put it out there in the world.
It's made me feel more Jewish than ever
Mm,
because I've been invited to so many like Jewish organizations internationally at this point since the book has come out. And I've just like had this sense of home, with the right kind of Jews, like the Jews who are just wanting to be loving and accepting and growth oriented. So that's been such a pleasant surprise. I hadn't stepped foot into like a synagogue for years before my book came out. And then I was invited to Temple Beth Am in LA for Shavuot last year
mm.
to talk about kissing girls on Shabbat. I was like, what is this real? This can be part of being Jewish. So that's been like so like just I can't even tell you how healing of my relationship to myself and to God and to Judaism. Um, and so I think that like I also feel more whole.
Mm.
I feel like I've been able to integrate from the trauma through writing and speaking and continuing to be vocal and be given an opportunity to make meaning out of what I've been through.
Um, you mentioned just a minute ago, sort of in passing, about your mother's, um, you know, her mental illness being potentially related to her kind of intergenerational, to her trauma around the Holocaust. I read somewhere else that your mom was born in a DP camp, and I'm wondering where, we read a lot these days about intergenerational trauma, and wondering how, if what role you think that played potentially in your family and also in the community that you came from, which is like such a Holocaust, like a Holocaust emigre kind of community.
Yeah, I think it made everyone around me and my family really scared of outsiders.
Mm,
Which understandably, if you're like my mother didn't have a lot of family. Her mother was one of several children, and many of them died in the camps. And so, they fled to America and learned to stay insular. And I think that was very much a part of how Hasidic Judaism became so enclosed, and like why there was so much protection from the outside world, why there was so much fear around people deviating. The outside world, it felt viscerally dangerous in a way that maybe my parents couldn't explain, but it was like in their blood to be afraid of outsiders.
mhm. And do you think that there's like, how does that, this is a very big question, I guess, but sort of does a community that is that insular just kind of continue? Like, is there a way to kind of for generational trauma that way to ease over time, or does there have to be something big that shifts for that not to be kind of passed on?
So it is, I've thought about it a lot, right? Because it's like, can we just shake them out of it?
Right.
People even say that to me when they read my book. They're like, I just want to shake you. Like you're just like stuck and like they don't, it's hard to describe like the layers and layers and layers of fear and indoctrination and like lack of information, how that made me do such dumb things. What's interesting to me is I think that it's sort of happening, like instead of it happening from like the top down level where it's like system changes are happening at the rabbi principal authority level, what's happening is people are accessing the internet and
Hmm.
it's more like like just imagine these invisible tunnels out of the community. People
Right.
can out now and they can even exit out because they have phones, they have Wi-Fi. If they don't have Wi-Fi, or they can like find a neighbors. It's just so easy now, so much easier than it used to be.
Hmm.
And I think that the numbers of people who are leaving these communities are growing year by year, according to like data that's collected by Footsteps and other researchers.
Yeah.
It'll happen slowly, like an erosion, I think.
One of the things that was interesting in your book is at the end you include a letter to your patients, kind of explaining how you came to write this and um, how it was a big shift for you after being trained with the kind of clinical notion that a therapist should keep their personal life out of the therapy room. Um, and I thought it was a really powerful letter and also a really helpful, sort of very concrete illustration about, I mean, there were many of these in the book, but it was another one about your sort of awareness of the ways that the rules that you were trained to follow might not be holy and unchangeable.
Yeah.
Um, how did you think about that letter and like that you needed to write it, or sort of that was going to be the kind of culminating piece of the book?
As I wrote the book, I just kept thinking about all of the clients I had seen, and I have been a therapist for almost 2 decades. I've supervised and treated hundreds and hundreds of people, and I knew I would never be able to find them. But I imagined how they might feel reading the book, and I couldn't get the images out of my head.
Mm,
And so one day the book was already complete, manuscript was edited, it was in publication stages, and that letter was birthed out of my gut. I
mm,
didn't I didn't strategize that that would be the culminating piece to the book. I just felt like I have to do this for them. And I think that's how the best writing is done.
hmm.
It's born out of you,
Yeah.
not str-
Right. So authentic and just like your voice coming through. You talked a little bit about your mom, but there's a question about your dad and whether he was a little bit more flexible than others, or whether that Sherry's asking whether she read too much into that and seeing that in your dad.
No, I think that was actually a very intuitive question. Good call, good catch. You got it. My father was much more like accepting, and he gave me so much love and support over the years. He always supported my sister, even when she wore pants, my sister Shawnee, even when she like had to go to non-Jewish treatment centers, he just would be like, "What do you need?" And he would give it to her. Always accepted her. When I started leaving the community after the end of this book, I stopped talking with him because I didn't want to break his heart. And my sisters kept telling me, and this is always the rhetoric, like if he knows he'll have a heart attack.
Mm,
People say that about anyone. Like even in like if your grandmother knows you're gay, she'll have a heart attack. Don't tell grandma. So many there's songs like that. It's
yeah.
like the trope. Um, so I just avoided my father because I didn't want him to have a heart attack, like literally. And I didn't talk with him for several years, but I did call him on October 10th, 2023. He
Mm,
was in jail, and I felt like whatever water had passed under that bridge, like whatever had happened, I needed to just ever just transcend that and call him. And I called him and I was honest with him. And I said, I'm not religious anymore. I have another child now, not from a Jewish marriage, like with a woman. And I didn't tell him it was with a woman, but I said, not from a Jewish marriage. I'm not remarried, but I did birth another child. And he listened to everything and he said, what did I ever do wrong as a parent that you thought you couldn't tell me this?
Mm, wow.
We both, I think, cried through that entire phone call. I still haven't told him that I'm gay. I may not. I don't know how much information he has now, but everything almost that needed to be said happened in that conversation, regardless.
Mm, that's really beautiful that you were able to have a real conversation with him in that way.
Yeah.
You mentioned book two. That's exciting to hear. Can you tell us a tiny bit about that, what we can expect?
Sure. I'm currently writing the proposal for book two, and it's about, America loves this before and after image. We love seeing like this person was a mess and now they're beautiful and their teeth are straight and everything looks great. People have tried to put my story into images like that. Magazine articles have written about it. I'm on websites with like before the wig and then the after. I'm out with my tattoos. Great. But that is not what healing from trauma looks like. I know that as a trauma therapist and a survivor. There's a very messy middle. There's a messy middle in which people have symptoms and do messy things. And book two is about my messy middle. The years in which I was trying to be out and gay in New York and um, got addicted to drugs and alcohol and did a lot of things that made no sense given the freedom I had just earned. But it dives into the messiness of trauma healing and recovery in a way that I hope will help other people who maybe expect themselves to just be done with it and just healed and just be an after picture.
Mhm.
The idea is to help other people embrace the process of healing and themselves throughout their process.
Great. Well, we look forward to that. Um, my last question is, or maybe my last question, we'll see, is a kind of a silly one, but I think I noticed that the chapter titles are all song lyrics.
Yeah.
Is that true? And that seemed fun, but also potentially funny for someone who grew up without popular culture. So I'm curious about your choice to do that and how you organize it that way.
Yeah, so part of the first like real exposure I had before I even got my cable connection brought into the corner of my living room and like before I did that, you'll see that happen in the book. Like I got internet.
I'm like
I
crouched on the floor to watch Grey's Anatomy. I love that image.
laptop, yeah. I'm still watching. I'm still hooked on these seasons. I hope Ellen Pompeo lives forever because I'm like a diehard. Um, I bought a CD at Barnes and Noble. I drove all the way down the Garden State Parkway to a Barnes and Noble that no one else knew. Like where I wouldn't see anyone I knew, and they had the music section in the back in those days. And I bought like a physical CD of Natasha Bedingfield's music and Sarah McLachlan, and I listened to it in the store, and then I played it in my car. And those words gave me like the images we were talking about, this idea of an outside and a world where I could feel like freedom and light and joy. And so music meant a lot to me. And I titled all of the chapters with song lyrics. And there's if you're on Spotify, there's an official Kissing Girls on Shabbat playlist with original Hebrew and like secular songs that are in the book.
Oh, so cool. I'm gonna look for that. Thank you. Um, well, thank you so much, Sarah, for this book and for this conversation and for sharing your story with us. And thanks also to all of you who are here with us today. As always, as I always say, there's more to discover at JWA, and we'll drop some links that um, are opportunities to learn a bit more. For example, in our encyclopedia, you can learn more about the history of Hasidic women in the US, also about the problem of agunot, chained wives who can't get a Jewish divorce from their husbands, which is a huge issue in the Orthodox community, still a big issue. You can read more about Jewish women's literature in the 21st century in the US, including memoirs, of which your book is is this book is a part of that. You can also listen to our podcast episode with Abby Stein about her memoir, Becoming Eve, about her journey leaving a Hasidic community and coming out as trans. Also, a really beautiful book. Um, there will be a recording of the session, which will be sent out tomorrow. This is the last book talk of our series this March, but not to fear, we will be back with more book talks. At the end of May and into June. And in May, we're actually going to be offering a brand new course, a new kind of course, which is on memoir writing and reading. We'll be sending out the information and registration link for that next week. And until next time, wishing everybody,
I
uh,
just throw a fast,
yes,
sorry.
yeah, sure.
Probably end. If I haven't gotten to see your comment and you want to connect, I'm on Instagram at Dr. Sara Glass, or you can sign up for my email list at drsaraglass.com and like just stay in touch and see what the other events are so I can get to people I may not have gotten to today. Thank you so much. Okay, sorry.
Absolutely. Please, I hope people will follow up. We'll send out the recordings for all of the book talks we've done, and you can always find any of the past ones. We've been doing book talks since the first week of the pandemic, so there are many, many, many on our website. People can find us there at jwa.org. Wishing everybody an early happy Passover. May it be liberating for all of us. And I hope everyone takes good care and stay safe. Take care of each other. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.